Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. On behalf of the New York State Federation of Lake Associations and the Syracuse University Environmental Finance Center, welcome to the webinar today on conflict management for organizations. This webinar is part of a webinar series aimed to assist New York lake associations and local government leaders grow their skills for better lake management. Our expert today will be providing a lesson on conflict management and how your organization can develop awareness and skills in order to transform conflict into opportunity. The New York State Federation of Lake Associations, or NYSFOLA, is committed to reaching our membership with important information. As it is for all organizations during this time of physical distancing, NYSFOLA's state and regional conferences have been canceled. While the opportunities to learn and network cannot be fully replaced, this webinar series does provide the opportunity to stay connected and continues to provide important information to our members. If you have any questions about NYSFOLA, please contact Nancy Mueller using the contact information shown, or you can also visit the website at nysfola.org. NYSFOLA is pleased to provide these webinars with our co-sponsor, the Syracuse University Environmental Finance Center. Syracuse University Environmental Finance Center enhances the managerial and financial capacity of regional and local governments, nonprofit organizations, and local residents to improve environmental infrastructure, services, and quality of life. Our partnership with NYSFOLA for this webinar series is supported under a grant by the Rural Utilities Service housed in the United States Department of Agriculture. We also want to welcome you to join NYSFOLA and the Environmental Finance Center for our future webinars. Webinars will be held on Thursday mornings from 10 to 11 a.m. Registration is open for the July webinars now, so please visit one of the websites listed at the bottom of this slide for registration information and more information. During the webinar today, everyone will be kept on mute to ensure audio quality. If you have a question, please type it into the GoToWebinar question dialog box at any time throughout the session. We will be holding all of the questions for a Q&A at the end of the presentation. We will also be posting the presentation as well as the video recording on the Syracuse University Environmental Finance Center's website. You will be receiving a follow-up email that includes links to all of these materials. Registered attendees can receive a certificate of attendance for participating in this webinar today. This webinar has not been submitted to licensing agencies for pre-approval of continuing education or training credits. If you require certificates of attendance in order to apply for credit hours, please contact Tess Clark at pclark@syr.edu. This information will also be provided in the follow-up email. And so on that note, I would like to introduce our speaker for today's webinar. With us today is Catherine Gerard, Director of the Program for Advancement of Research and Conflict and Collaboration in the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University. So Catherine, welcome, and I pass everything over to you.
Good morning. Thank you for attending the webinar. Our topic, as Savannah said, is managing conflicts, and the goal is to look at some real basic skills and thinking about how to be very strategic and goal-driven in thinking about conflict. So if you notice, let's start with a definition of conflict. The conflict, as we're going to talk about it, is an expressed struggle, meaning it's already out there, it's not under the table. It's between multiple parties that are interdependent in the sense that they somehow need each other, either to accomplish what they want or to get the other person sort of out of the way. Often conflicts involve strong emotion, and that can be one of the things that makes conflict difficult. We'll talk a bit about that. And the conflict itself is a perception that I can't get something that I want because you're in the way. So it's often defined as incompatible goals, incompatible objectives. But again, it's a perception. The parties believe that I can't get what I want because the other person is in the way or the other party is in the way. So that's the definition of conflict that we're going to be using. And I want to start by thinking about the nature of conflicts. For some people, conflicts are scary. They're seen as highly destructive. In some organizations, the views on conflict are if people are engaged in conflict, we stop them, we separate them. And our view is that nothing productive often happens without conflict. Conflict is a disagreement. It's an opportunity to share diverse perspectives. So often when people look at conflict, they talk about constructive conflict and destructive conflict. Constructive conflict will sometimes be called issues, task conflict, and destructive conflict is typically referred to as personal conflict. So constructive conflicts are what we try to get in organizations. We try to get a debate, exchange of ideas, resulting in solutions that are mutual gains, and in fact may be better than the idea that one person might have had. Constructive conflicts do not rely on power or violence in the worst case, but in an organization, they're not relying on the fact that one person has badgered the other person or a person of higher power has basically made the solution. So constructive conflicts are really about exchange, conversation, and building relationship so that there is the ability to come up with outcomes that satisfy both of the parties in the conflict. Destructive conflict is where it becomes personal. It's no longer about the issue, it's now about the people. And obviously, destructive conflict is harmful to people and to organizations because it destroys relationship. It impairs decision-making ability. This is the kind of conflict that may lead to lower performance. And sometimes it leads to this reliance on power. Managers have to come in and break things up or make decisions. And the challenge in an organization is that when you've got constructive conflict, task conflict, we're talking about an issue, it can sometimes start moving into the destructive. So you and I are having a heated conversation about an issue of environmental pollution, and I have a point of view and you have a point of view, and they seem to be mutually exclusive. And all of a sudden you say to me, well, Catherine, that's just a really dumb idea, and I'm kind of sick of hearing it. That is that constructive conflict moving in the wrong direction towards a destructive conflict. And so the challenge as we see it is to pull it back, right? Not to stop it, but to pull it back so that we are keeping the conflicts constructive. So our view here is that we're not stopping conflict, particularly in organizations. We want constructive conflict, but the job of managers or the job of facilitators of environmental conflict groups, whoever you might be, is to make sure that we are transforming conflicts to either keep them at the constructive level, or if they are destructive, to figure out how do we transform them so that we're getting the positive conflict that we need to make change. So that's kind of our way of thinking about conflict to start with. And of course, the question is, well, how do we do this, right? How do we engage constructively in conflict? And in our short time together, I'm going to cover three things. One is to make sure that you are keeping your eye on the source of the conflict, because sometimes what happens is we lose our focus on what the conflict started as, because it starts becoming personal, it starts becoming destructive. So if I ask people, well, gee, what's the conflict about? They'll say, oh, it's a personality conflict. And I'll say, well, tell me the conflict, tell me where it started. And it may turn out that it was about, we had a disagreement on a date, we had a disagreement on how to approach something, but over time we lost that. And all of a sudden we can only remember that it's now personal. And obviously solving personality is, hard to do. solving a real source of a conflict can be much easier. So we'll talk about that. The second thing to think about is how you approach the conflict. And many, if not all of you, filled out a conflict approach survey. And so we'll be talking about those options that are always at your disposal so that you become a situational conflict manager. And then finally, managing conflict takes skills, relational skills. How do we engage in conflict in a way that builds relationship, builds creativity, and builds the motivation for us to have mutually satisfying solutions rather than a motivation that says, I'm going to win, you're going to lose, and that's actually going to make me happy. And after a while, I don't even care about the quality of the solution because I just want to win. That's not what we're after. And so we'll talk about what are called these relational communication skills. That's a lot in an hour, but I think we can do it. So I'm going to test you here. We'll have a poll question in a minute to get you thinking about your ability to identify the true source of a conflict. So I will be asking you to think about an example, just pick one, of a conflict you've experienced or you are experiencing that comes to your mind because perhaps it was challenging or is challenging. And I'll ask you to think about the sources. What was the actual source of the conflict? We'll have a polling question, so you'll be able to vote on the source that you think was most instrumental in your conflict. But here are some of the typical sources that you will be able to choose from. Sometimes conflicts are about the distribution of resources, money, time, effort, right? We're arguing about how much work I should do or you should do, what the deadline should be, how much money, etc. So the distribution of resources, which are again perceived as limited, perceived as scarce, is often typically a source of a conflict. Data, sometimes we're going to fight about the data, whose data is right. I put that up there because that's becoming more and more common. The nature of relationship, and here it's typically about power. The conflict is being affected because I have more power than you do, or I have allies, or there's just something about the nature of the relationship that the conflict is really about. Mutually exclusive goals. We want different things, and we don't see that there's any way of pulling them together. The means to achieving goals. Sometimes we agree on the goal, but in fact, we have very different ways of approaching it. We can both say, yes, we want that lake to be as clean as it can be, but we may have extremely different views of how to get there. And then finally, values. And values are beliefs. And these are the toughest ones to solve. Those are not conflicts that we solve through negotiation. These are things that involve dialogue and other sorts of sharing, because obviously my belief system is as valid as your belief system. So that when we come to values conflicts, those are particularly difficult to deal with. So as I mentioned, Savannah is going to involve you in a poll question. Again, think about a conflict, think about the source of the conflict, vote on which one you think is most relevant, and in a minute, Savannah will share the results of the poll.
Great, and we'll keep this poll open for just a few more moments here. And we'll get ready to close this poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And so, Catherine, it looks like the majority of attendees at 29% selected different means to achieve goals. 22 selected nature of relationship. 20% of attendees selected values. 16% of attendees selected mutually exclusive goals, and 10% selected distribution of resources.
Thank you. So it sounds like we probably have different conflicts, and clearly we've got different sources, and there are different approaches, obviously, depending on the nature of the source. Scarce resources is generally quite open to negotiation. That can be a relatively simple one. Nature of relationship takes some conversation, because it's not something you negotiate. It takes conversation before reaching agreement. And the others as well, other than the values, are things that I think will be amenable to some of the skills we'll be talking about today. Again, the values is more challenging. And so those of you who have the values conflicts may have a little more work in terms of engaging in conversation, not to change values, because, as you know, what right do I have to change someone's values, but at least to engage in enough sharing and understanding of our values and why we have them to see if there's an opportunity to come up with some sort of meaningful action. So that's number one, right? And after a while, you'll become really just able to hone in very quickly on the source, so that as you engage with others, you're engaging about the right thing. So the second how here is how to choose your conflict approach. And you have choices here, and that's the thing to understand, that you are in control of this conflict. You get to choose how you approach the conflict. And the simple way of thinking about this, and this is something we use with lots of students, I'll use it with you, is a model that says flight, fight, unite. Right? I can fly away, I can leave this conflict, I can fight, use my power, use the law to fight and get my way, or I can join with other people in a more collaborative approach to conflict. So what I would ask you to do as you're sitting there watching is either out loud or in your brain, say flight, fight, unite. Okay, one more time. Flight, fight, unite. Okay, why do I ask you to do that? And if we had a group of 100 students, they'd be screaming flight, fight, unite. Because it embeds in your brain when you are walking into a conflict situation. It's nice to be thinking, what do I want to do? Do I want to walk away? Do I want to win? Do I want to unite? Now, here is the more academic version of flight, fight, unite. And this is your survey. So those of you who have the chance to fill out the survey or will fill out the survey, this is the model that you used. And notice what it's saying. What this adds to the flight, fight, unite is the fact that when you choose a conflict approach, you are managing two tensions. And the tensions are between people, relationship, how much do I need to build relationship with the other person that I'm in conflict with, and how much do I need to achieve my personal goals. And so as you look at your survey results, you'll see that you have results in each of these categories. So I'll just go over them quickly, but let me make the point that this is what's called a situational conflict management model, meaning all of these approaches are valid, important, and it's your job to figure out which approach to use at which point in time. So this is a strategic model, a strategic situational model of conflict. So let me start with the controller. The controller says, I care so much about getting what I want that I will forego building relationships with others. This is the win-lose. I win because I get my way. I lose because I am foregoing relationship building. But obviously there are times when the controller style makes sense. It's a rule, it's the policy, it's the law, it is a crisis. So there are times where you use your power to win. And obviously in the controller style, you better have power, you better have allies, or you better be the most amazing persuader in the world, because again, the controller style is a win-lose style. If I go towards the other direction, the accommodator style, this is lose-win. I do not get what I want because I have strategically, intentionally given in to the other party on purpose. I let that party have their way. And I do it for a strategic reason, because I need to build relationship with that person. That is the most critical issue. I may need social credibility for the next negotiation we're going to be engaging in. It may be my boss, maybe my spouse. So I strategically am making the decision that I really need relationship so much that the issue is not as important, and therefore I will accommodate. So that's the lose-win. The avoider, which is below that, is when you don't engage. It's the flight, and it's lose-lose, which makes it sound bad, but it's not. It's very important, and we need to avoid, because sometimes the conflict could be dangerous. The conflict may be no-win. We could lose credibility by engaging. It may be trivial, not worth our time. Or if you're a manager, this is a big one. Sometimes your employees will drag you into a conflict that is not yours. And therefore, you want to shift it back to them. You want them to handle the conflict because it's really theirs. So again, the avoider style, even though it's a lose-lose, is an important part of your approach to conflict. The other two are the unite styles. And they are compromise and collaboration. And I will bet that quite a few of you came out strongly on the compromise collaboration. So let me just quickly give you a sense of why they're different. This is what's called a positive bargaining zone. And so let's say you're selling a house and your target price is $240,000. But what you will take is $225,000, and the buyer is willing to pay $235,000, but they'd really like to get it for $220,000. This is a classic situation of compromise, where you're just dividing up resources, and it will work really well. It's really efficient because what you have is a positive bargaining zone, right? You've got that overlap here that will allow compromise to happen very quickly, very effectively, depending on persuasion and style and relationship. And you'll probably come out, somewhere in the middle, maybe at 230. So that's compromise. Compromise is typically a give or take, mini win, mini lose, but it really works well in a resource-oriented situation, particularly where you've got this positive bargaining zone. One of the challenges with compromise comes up when you don't have it. So here's a situation, and we can add some zeros here, where the seller is saying, I will not sell this thing for any less than, in this case, $18. Let's say it's $180,000. And the seller is saying, wait a minute, I literally cannot, or the buyer is saying, I cannot pay more than $150,000. It just does not exist. There is no way. That's a negative bargaining zone, and compromise doesn't work because there's nothing to compromise. If I only have $150,000, that's it. And if the seller will only take $180,000, that's it. We've got a $30,000 gap. So what do we do? This is where, again, we've got this challenge between compromise and collaboration. So compromise says we have something to distribute. Collaboration says, we may not have something to distribute, and therefore we've got to get creative. We've got to reach beyond the positions, 150,000, 180,000, and we've got to get creative in what's called expanding the pie. And so what do? In a collaboration situation, we think about interests or needs. We start exploring whether there are other ways of reaching an agreement beyond, in this case, just the money, beyond just these narrow positions. And we may say, okay, well, the seller talks to the buyer, or the buyer talks to the seller, and they start exploring other opportunities. What can we throw in? We can, I'll throw in the furniture. I'll throw in the lawnmower. I'll throw in other sorts of things. And that will only work based on, again, what different parties want. So if the buyer is willing to try to come up with stuff that makes the seller happy, I'll mow your lawn for a year. I'll give you my snowmobile, and obviously I'm being quite creative here. I don't drive a snowmobile, so that wouldn't appeal to me because that's not aligned with my interests. If you said I'll mow a lawn for a year, that works for me. So what is collaboration then as opposed to compromise? Compromise, again, assumes this kind of fixed pie. We're just trying to divide up resources. Collaboration says we have to get creative to come up with true win-win, which means we walk away feeling like we have really mutually satisfied each other's needs and concerns. And therefore, collaboration requires more conversation and more understanding of what it is I need and the other party needs, so that we can come up with more creative ways of enriching an agreement. And again, we'll talk about that a little bit more. But let me give you a second to go back and look at your survey results. And after the program, it might be interesting to think, why do I have those results? And in particular, whether I'm so wedded to a particular conflict approach that it's preventing me from being situational, right? So that's the key. If I have a super strong pattern of collaboration or compromise, if I'm unite all the time, does that then make it more challenging for me to engage in a win-lose or to walk away? So that's what you really want to be thinking about. How strong are those patterns? And how do you get more flexible? How do you get more comfortable at engaging in each of those styles? Again, the conclusion here is to say that managing a conflict requires your mind, an analysis of the conflict, in terms of sources, in terms of the best approach, given what you need, and then to be facile at moving among approaches so that you can, in fact, be a situational conflict manager. Okay, let me now move towards our third area, which starts getting at what we call these relational skills. And now we're starting to talk about this emotion piece and these perceptions that your goals are blocking my goals. And as we talk about the kind of skills that one needs in conflict management, again, we're talking about relational communication, particularly if we're thinking collaboration. How do we engage in communication that enhances relationship and doesn't destroy it? Because again, if we don't trust each other, it's going to be very challenging to engage in any sort of collaborative or even compromise approaches. I'm throwing this up here, some of you may know this, to make the point that often now as we teach conflict management, we go back to Daniel Goleman and other people's work on emotional intelligence. Because to engage in conflict management, particularly again in the collaborative way, we have to be very cognizant of our emotions and of the emotions of others. And that's what emotional intelligence indicates, that we have to be careful of getting triggered by the other. We have to be careful of triggering others, because often the emotion can take over and we've lost our ability to control the conflict in the direction that we want to move. So I simply make the point for those of you who are familiar with the emotional intelligence literature that we are right in the middle of that area, where we have to think about our emotions, the emotions of others, We have to regulate our emotions. If we get triggered, it's all over. And then, as Goleman points out, one of the key skills in relationship building is, in fact, conflict management. So let's talk about some skills that are essential for managing conflict. Many of them you know, all of them you know, so this will be just a quick review. Some of the skills obviously are listening and the ability to not only listen passively, but actively, to show the other person that you've heard what they say, called active empathetic listening. The ability to ask questions, absolutely key, to figure out what the other person is thinking. So to listen and ask. The ability to not to jump in when we hear something and take over. These are called high-risk responses. And then the ability to make a statement, to either advocate or assert our point of view, which is obviously quite important, but in a way that doesn't shut down or block the continuation of the conversation. So I'll just quickly review them for you, and then we will have questions and answers. So reflective listening, remember, listening results is the key to problem solving. In conflict work, we really talk about listening because, number one, it's a sign of respect, it builds relationship, but often in a highly emotional situation, the act of active listening, which I'll mention in a minute, the act of active listening can actually de-escalate an emotion. There are many models of the kind of listening we're talking about. And the model we use is on the bottom, but let me say that you all have your own models of active listening. Some of you may use the I'm hearing you say, you seem to be saying X or Y. Active listening is simply repeating or summarizing to the speaker what they said to you. The model that we use is on the bottom. We use a model that incorporates the emotions. So this is an empathetic listening approach. It seems like you're concerned. It seems like you're upset. It seems like you're angry about what? So emotion plus the substance of what the person's saying. So again, let me just review. What do we mean by active listening? Active listening means that when someone is speaking, you are spending 100% of your brain listening. What we typically do is we are preparing our own response. We're terrible listeners. Active listening is a way of disciplining ourselves to listen to the speaker, take in the words, take in the body language, and literally echo, repeat, summarize for the listener what you heard and the emotion that you picked up. And after you finish reflective listening, you are going to get the nod, and that's when you know that you're ready to move on. Now, part of the problem is sometimes the way that we move on after we do our active listening is we jump in. And we jump in different ways. And these are called high-risk responses because they may re-escalate or even make worse the conflict, because people now don't feel respected. They feel like, you know, you're taking the power which you had given to them in active listening. You're taking the power back. So what are some of these high-risk responses that, by the way, all of us engage in? We're not terrible people. These are just communication patterns. One is when we solve it. So someone says, gee, you know, I'm really upset about this project, and we jump in and say, well, here's how you could fix it. And remember, they haven't asked for advice. They've just told us they're upset. Or sometimes we evaluate. And evaluation can even be positive. Oh, you're wonderful. Don't worry about it. You'll get it done. Or withdrawal, where sometimes we get so concerned about the emotion that someone's bringing to us that we shift the conversation to something else. Could be, what are you doing this weekend? Oh, tell me what you're doing this weekend. So high-risk responses, again, we often engage in. So we do a great job of reflective listening, But instead of then allowing the conversation to go further and the power to remain with the speaker, we jump in and we engage in these high-risk responses. So that's something to really think about in your spare time, is do you engage in any of these patterns? Are there patterns that you just unconsciously engage in when someone comes to you and is sharing something that you may want to become more conscious of? So what should you be doing? The pattern is that after you engage in reflective listening, what you should be doing is using a question, inquiry. Because what you're really doing is you're trying to figure out where that person is at, and you're trying to get permission to move forward. So an open-ended question. So someone comes to you with an issue, you say, gee, you seem really concerned that you don't have much time to finish that project. The person nods, and instead of jumping in and offering advice, you say, gee, you know, tell me more about that. Or can you give me a sense of whether I could be helpful? Or would you like my point of view? Or something open-ended that either keeps the conversation going or that gives you permission to join. Now, why would you want to keep the conversation going? Because remember, in conflict work, you are trying to figure out what is in someone's head. How are they perceiving the conflict? What's their story of the conflict? So the more you can get people talking about the conflict, the more data you're going to have in understanding what they think the conflict is. So again, as I mentioned, you want to engage in inquiry, but there's a particular kind of inquiry that's essential if you want to be engaging in collaboration. And that is called interest inquiry, which is a fancy name of saying, ask questions when you hear a demand that will help you get at the person's needs, concerns, or interests. And let me go to my iceberg metaphor for this one. What this is saying is that often when you're in a conflict, what you're going to be hearing are lots of what we call positions or demands. The what I want you to get rid of power boats. I want DEC to handle this. There are too many regulations. We should have fewer regulations, right? That's what we often hear. And we can get triggered by these demands or by these positions and start debating them, which means we're now shifting automatically into either compromise or win-lose. And the bottom line is we don't even maybe really know what's going on here. So what the collaboration style would say is when you hear a position, ask a question. So if we got rid of power boats, how would that make you more satisfied? Or why are you concerned about power boats? Or why do you think DEC should handle this? Because what you're really going after are what are called interests. These are the needs, the concerns that underlie the positions. And once you know the interests, the powerboat thing, it's really about safety. That gives you the space to engage in a new conversation about safety, which may enrich the conversation and allow you to come up with many more ideas or actions beyond the powerboat. So again, the point is to not get trapped into a position because that's going to be a fixed pie, but to ask the inquiry question. And here are some examples, I think. How would things change if we got rid of powerboats? Why are you concerned about this? What would happen if? How would things be better? So any broad question that starts from the position and tries to uncover the deeper interest. Okay, finally, I want to make the point about assertion, or how you make your point of view known. And then I'm going to swing back to why these interests are important. So obviously there are many ways of sharing your point of view, and we always come up with different models, because models are interesting ways of disciplining ourselves. And the models that we will train people in are feedback models, which are a combination of behavior and impact. When you did something specific, here was the impact. Or position rationale. Because again, the impact rationale piece are what open up a conversation. If we stop at just the beginning of that, it's the potential to move into conflict, right? I think we should invest tax money. What do you mean we should invest tax money? Whereas I think we should invest tax money in cleaning the lake because the implications for the spread are statewide. Whole different conversation than if we stop at the level of position. So again, in presenting our point of view, the more data, the more we present the rationale. Or if it's in an organization and we're talking about something that someone did, we have to be careful again of generalizing. When you were late with the report, you're just really uncommitted. You're just, you just don't respect the other members of the team. Woo, right? That's a leap of abstraction. And so what we always want to do is we want to get at the specific behavior and the impact of that behavior. Why was that behavior either good or bad? So again, the way that you share your point of view is going to be really essential. So let me wrap up these skills by bringing you to really the collaboration model, which is also called interest-based conflict resolution, win-win negotiation, because again, it is powerful. And in environmental work in particular, as many of you experts out there know, this is often the kind of model that's used when you're doing group environmental planning. So the model that's most popular in this area is from the Getting to Yes book that probably many of you have. And I'll just mention what it says. It says, first of all, be emotionally intelligent. Separate the people from the problem, right? Don't get triggered by the person you're talking to, whom you may have a bad relationship with. You may not trust them, but engage in that emotional intelligence so that you are neutral and you've created a neutral environment. And listen to the story, right? Make sure that you're enabling everybody who's at the table to really tell the story so that you're understanding what their perception of the conflict is. Focus on the interests, not the positions. When you hear those positions, use inquiry and try to figure out what are the underlying interests that are driving this conflict. And in some cases, you may find out that there's common ground. Once you do that, this model says start brainstorming. How do we fill that gap? That the fact that we have this negative bargaining zone. What are all the creative ways that we could come up with to fill that gap? Because remember, we're not compromising here. We are trying to come up with creative interest-based solutions. And then finally, the way that we decide which ones we go forward with are to use a set of criteria that everybody has agreed upon. So that is, in fact, what is collaboration. So when you filled out your survey and you said you're a collaborator, that's what collaboration is. So let me end by saying that in the short time, what I'm suggesting is that managing conflict means being strategic. And being strategic means being goal-driven, to be thinking ahead of time about who do I want to be in the conflict and what do I want to achieve in managing the conflict. And so obviously some of the key questions we've looked at a very little bit is how do I feel comfortable with conflict? How do I think about this constructive, destructive thing and say, yeah, conflict is good. Conflict is important. We can come out of this with something more than when we entered. How do I figure out the source of the conflict? Again, don't get seduced by people saying, oh, it's just that Mary's a pain in the neck and blah, 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 blah. spend time. In conflict work, we often say 80% of the work is analysis, 20% is intervention. What approach to the conflict will I use? Remember, you're in charge, and people may, come in there with a win-lose approach, and it's possible through good communication sometimes to shift them to a different kind of approach. So what approach is important? Which situational approach do you want to use? How do I deeply understand the other party's perspective beyond the position? How do I really get what's going on so I don't solve the wrong problem, right? I may solve that little problem and then they come back and come back and come back because I've missed the true interest. How and when do I assert my views in ways that do not escalate, but that add knowledge and data that further the conversation? And then finally, how do I shift to mutual gain by understanding and working with interests rather than getting stuck into positions? So I have covered a ton of material here. Thank you for your patience, and I hope that you've got some interesting questions to put forward. So thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. So I do just want to reiterate to folks on the call, please submit any questions that you have in that questions dialog box. And we have received a few questions, so I'm just going to start rolling them out to you. So an attendee asked, how do I effectively encourage people to take risks, overcome fear of the unknown, counter the what if arguments, especially before a problem is at its critical mass?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think part of it is modeling through the inquiry. So, when there's something on the table, that skill of asking questions, not in a threatening way, but asking quality questions and encouraging others to ask quality questions, not interrogation, never putting someone on the spot, but throwing a question out that maybe others start responding to, that creates a culture that says, our culture is a culture of exploration. It's not a culture of a right answer. It's a culture of exploration, because if we really understand our goals and our interests, there are lots of right answers. So again, this is much more challenging than I'm addressing here, but I do think that skillful inquiry, rather than if you're a manager and you have the power, using that power shuts it off. That's what creates the risk, is power. People feeling they'll be wrong. And also it gets at a finding. Google surveyed their teams and found out that the reason their teams were creative was because they had a sense of psychological safety, which means that people felt they could say anything without being ridiculed. And trying to create that, again, I think through this kind of, we're having a conversation here, and our goal is to get lots of point of view, and we're not going to judge them. That's that brainstorming notion. We don't judge them, because our goal is to get them out so that we can wind up with something new and creative.
Great. And so another question is, an attendee asked, how do we employ some of these techniques if the other persons or people aren't interested in using them too?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and it can be pretty challenging. And I was going to mention, if you go back to your pattern, that survey you did, there is a pattern there that is really, really challenging to deal with. And that's the person who walks in the door as win-lose controller. And then if they can't win, they move to avoider, which means they walk away. And that is a non-negotiating style. That's saying, if I can't have my way, I'm out of here. I'm not willing to negotiate. And that one's tough. That one, in some ways, you have to have a lot of power, or you try to, you try to know them so well that you can appeal to the shared interests. But that is a really tough thing to deal with. Often, again, I know I'm being a kind of an inquiry freak here and an assertion freak. But when people walk in a kind of they're quick to compromise. You may get that one. That people just, yeah, we can do a deal here, 6 of these, 4 of these, 5 of these, without even thinking about the implications of it, because they just want the deal. And Americans are like this. We love quick closure. And so again, I think the inquiry comes in sometimes when you ask that question. Well, gee, if we agree to that, how would that affect X, Y, Z? Or again, saying, gee, you want to do this. The sort of why question, what's driving that for you? And then when you get it, you can sort of shift the conversation a little bit towards the interests or the concerns. So I think there are some more guerrilla techniques in a way when you're in the conversation to shift. The other is at the beginning, depending on the power situation you're in, is to sort of say, I'd like to run this conversation or this negotiation in this particular way, and seeing whether or not people would agree to a different kind of negotiating approach. But sometimes you've just got to be a skillful guerrilla, and the person doesn't even know what you're doing, but you've now started really expanding the conversation.
Great. So another question. You may be an active listener, but the other person may not. How do you encourage or require the other person to listen to you? Maybe some cultural issues involved in this, but how do you help open that floor a little bit more?
Yeah. Now, if you're a manager, you can train everybody, and you can actually kind of hold people accountable for that. If you're not a manager and you're in a situation, there are people who are in advocacy mode all the time, right? They're just telling you, boom, boom, boom. They don't want to listen. They're in win-lose. And they think if they just tell you enough times, they'll wear you down, and, you'll either walk away or you'll agree. And of course, that's not a conversation. That's one way. That's not a conversation. And negotiation essentially is a conversation. So that's where, in some ways, you maybe move to your assertion, depending on who the person is, and use that kind of assertion statement. When I'm not feeling I have space in this conversation, or I've heard your point of view a number of times, and I would like to be able to offer mine. Is that okay? So that combination of assertion and question. The question can sometimes break the pattern. So it's really challenging if you can't require people. Again, you just have to move them in the space, and sometimes asserting, I don't feel comfortable talking to you because you're not giving me an opportunity to share what I think. And then when you share what you think, you use the quick question. So what did you hear me say, or what do you think? Or, so something that makes sure that they, in fact, have listened to you. But, it's really, really hard. You can't force people. You often have to just finesse it with your skills in order to make the conversation more fruitful.
Great. So next question. How do you deal with a spoiler? Someone who's only there to promote a specific agenda and not the one that's necessarily in the public interest.
Wow. So I assume we're talking about a group situation. Actually, Meredith and I were talking earlier, it might be interesting to think about more work in that sort of area of how do you design so that you can mitigate that. In the group setting, so we do a few things. One is we have ground rules, and make sure that there's a facilitator who can enforce those ground rules. And one of the ground rules can deal with that. The other is we often try to talk about spoilers as spoiling behavior, because sometimes, and not all the time, but sometimes the spoilers have a point of view that they feel has been neglected, or they have a history that it actually can become important to the conversation. So I'm not debating that there aren't people sometimes who are just there to be destructive. And that often has to be dealt with through the ground rules, manipulating the power balance. If that person's the strongest person in the room, you're going to have trouble. So manipulating the power balance, having a facilitator and ground rules, and again, a skillful process where the process is a conversation and the person actually has to talk about the implications of what they're saying. And there's a process that says, okay, here are all the points of view, all the interests, and now we're building together through brainstorm. So process can often mitigate the power of a spoiler.
Wonderful. So the next question is, what is the next course of action when during the reflective listening, you realize that the speaker may be just venting and not providing any hooks for building a relationship moving forward?
That's an interesting one, because venting is okay. Sometimes people need to vent. And sometimes venting can be positive because it builds relationship. Sometimes venting, can get a little too much. And that's generally, again, where the question, the repetition of the reflective listening question comes in. So I've heard you say this. Are you interested in talking about solutions? So it's that, continuing to reflect, so that they know they heard, and then asking that question that tries to figure out, do they just want to talk for 20 minutes? Or is there a shifting towards a two-way conversation and not just a one-way conversation? But I think, shutting down venting, just boom, let's move on, is really can be a high risk response and can damage relationship. So I think that model of making sure you're using inquiry to get a sense of, moving that person forward, is probably the way to think about it. More listening, more inquiry, so that you're in some ways putting the person on the spot in a nice way, but at least getting a sense of what you're supposed to do. Or do they just want you to listen more, or are they really coming to some sort of closure so you can, shift towards whatever solution setting or action?
Thanks, Catherine. So a couple more questions here. So for folks on the call, if we do not answer your question live, we will be able to follow up with you via email, but we only have a few left, so I think we can get through them. So an attendee asked, if we could have some discussion about how to deal with different values. So an example of, do we return the lake to nature, the uses of the lake, prickly problems of invasive species control, whether to use chemicals or not. Some agree with it, some don't.
Yeah, that's a really tough one. And I think, and you may be right, they may be values. I would say before assuming that they are intractable values, which they may be, but before assuming they're intractable values, I think it's worth engaging in that kind of collaborative conversation that encourages some level of brainstorm. Now, you may get people who say, no, any chemical is bad. I won't agree to it. But there's going to be a cost to that, right? The implications. Now, maybe they've got a non-chemical solution that's fabulous. But on the other hand, the implications, having some discussion of, what's our vision of this lake? What are our interests in the lake? Do we care that we can use the lake, or do we care that the lake remains healthy? So those needs or concerns, what we talked about as interests. So the question is, what is really the underlying interest in saying we should not use chemicals? Is it safety concerns? What are those underlying interests? Because remember, don't use chemicals is not a value. That's a position, right? That's my position. I don't want us to use chemicals. Great. Why? What are your concerns about chemicals? And then ultimately, what do we have a common view in our conversation of what we think the lake should even be? And so I would say, before assuming all is lost on values, I would certainly make sure that we're not thinking that the positions are the values. If you do have that values conflict, it's about dialogue. It's just about further conversation, further information being shared on both sides, and often sometimes, as I said before, moving towards this notion of the implications or the vision. So I guess it's the thing with values is it's not negotiation, right? It's not. If you jump to negotiation, you could damage relationship. It's about hearing what the person's saying, making sure it actually is a value, a core interest. It's not a position that we've jumped after, and then exploring it around the notion of even whether there's a common vision and what the implications would be long term. If we went with sort of one set of interests versus another. Often the good news is often it turns out there's shared interests, and that then can mitigate some of these really intractable positions.
Great. So we have hit the top of the hour. So Catherine, I would like to thank you so much for providing your expertise for this presentation today. For folks on the call still, you will be receiving a follow-up email after this webinar that includes a link to an evaluation survey. And we kindly ask if you have a few moments to let us know your thoughts of today's session. So Catherine, again, thank you so much for providing all of this information. I throw it back to you for any closing comments.
Good luck with your conflicts. Be constructive and try to get at those interests. So thank you.
All right, thank you all. Have a great afternoon.